Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is assemble our lap loom. This loom is amazing because all you have to do is insert these two dowels to assemble it. It's so easy to put together and take apart. Once you warp your loom, that is what's going to keep your loom put together well and secure for your project. So to warp your loom, you want to use warp string. Warp string is typically made of cotton, and that's important because you want a warp string that isn't stretchy and it's not too slippery. So the first thing I want you to do, you don't have to make any cuts, is make an overhand knot at the end of your warp string. So I'm going to go really slow here. Just make a loop at the end of your warp string. Secure a knot. And this is how you will attach your warp string to your loom. So it should look like that. All right, so take the loop you just secured. And one thing that you need to think about before you start is the width you want your project to be. You can do a width that takes up the entire loom, or you can do a more narrow project. If you're gonna do a more narrow project, I like to have my project centered on my loom. And so when I do that, you just need to make sure you are counting how many like pegs you are starting in on from the bottom left, and then making sure you're wrapping your warp string around that same corresponding peg at the top. So for example, let's warp this loom, and I'm gonna count in 3 pegs and loop my warp string around the 4th. When you go to warp your loom, it is important to keep even tension on the warp string throughout. Once you start, you shouldn't stop, because then you're gonna lose your tension on the string. So I am going to make sure I keep some good tension on this warp string, and I'm gonna bring it up. I'm gonna count 3 in, and I'm gonna wrap it around the 4th little peg at the top. I'm gonna bring it all the way down. If you are a beginner using this loom, I would skip a peg at the bottom so that your warp is a little more widely spaced, and I'll explain that more in a little bit. So I'm bringing it up to the top, wrapping it around, keeping tension on the warp string, skipping a little notch here, going around the next one, and so on and so forth. Because I want my project evenly centered on this loom, I'll make sure I stop warping with 3 little notches left, since I started 3 notches in. Now, if you begin with your overhand knot on the bottom left versus the top, you want to make sure you end warping your loom on the bottom right. That will give you an even number of warp strings, which will be helpful for your project. I'm trying to keep some good tension on this warp string. Almost done. All right. So now I am going to cut my warp string off of the roll here. And what I want to do is, this gets a little tricky because you want to keep tension on the warp string. Bring the end of it up and tie another little loop knot around the last warp string going down. It's taking me a few tries here. All right, I'm gonna double that knot up. Once you get the first knot in, it's a lot easier. Okay, so this loom is warped. Now, the next thing you should do is you should kind of bring your hand across this and feel the tension of your warp string. I can tell that, you know, the tension feels really good, and this always happens to me, and then I lose the tension kind of here at the end at the last couple warp strings. So what you can do to fix that is you can gently transition the looser tension on this end of the loom into the more tense parts, I guess. So what you can do is you can take your string and kind of just shift that lack of tension over into the more tense areas. So this is already getting more tense. You really want the tension to be pretty even throughout your warp strings so that your project looks nice and even and uniform. If you totally mess this step up, you know, practice and try it again. I wouldn't move forward with your project until you feel like you have it warped pretty good. It does not have to be perfect, just because you will kind of pay for it later if you have a really loose area of warp strings. It's still a little loose over here. I'm gonna do that one more time. Tightening up these strings on the end. Okay, that feels pretty good. That's it.